Welcome back to Your 1230, the only podcast where our guests tell their story with the help of 12 questions in just 30 minutes. I'm your host, Mike Salitro, and today we are very excited to be speaking with Mark Graban. Mark is an author, speaker, and consultant whose latest book, The Mistakes That Make Us: Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation, is available now. He's also the author of the award-winning book, Lean Hospitals: Improving Quality, Patient Safety, and Employee Engagement, and others, including Measures of Success, React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. He serves as a consultant through his company, Constancy, Inc., and is also a senior advisor for the technology company, KaiNexus. Mark hosts podcasts, including Lean Blog Interviews and My Favorite Mistake. He's got a BS in Industrial Engineering from Northwestern, and an MS in Mechanical Engineering and MBA from MIT, MIT's Leaders for Global Operations program. Mark, welcome. We are really thrilled to be speaking with you.
Hey, Mike, thanks for having me.
Of course. And there are so many things I want to follow up on, but I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning there, the latest book, The Mistakes That Make Us. How have you been able to refocus or reposition the conversation on mistakes? Because I would think most people don't want to talk about them, but how have you been able to kind of shed a light on how we can make it into a positive, or how it can cultivate that culture that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors. One is some mentors that I've had in different workplaces, both back in manufacturing. You could look at Roots, former Toyota people that I've gotten to work with and learn from. And then in healthcare, there were some really high-performing organizations. And one of the common themes is the idea that they learn from their mistakes, right? We try to prevent mistakes, but when they occur, let's make sure we learn from them instead of punishing mistakes and driving them underground. You can't solve a problem that you don't know about. So that's been imprinted on me and reinforced in different ways through my career. And then September 2020 was kind of a pandemic project to start a new podcast series called My Favorite Mistake. And to your point, can I find enough people, successful people, willing to share a mistake? It started with one, and it was conversations with an opportunity to interview Kevin Harrington, who was a shark on season 1 of Shark Tank. He got pitched for my podcast about quote unquote lean management. I'm like, it's probably not a fit, but I'd love to talk to him. And he was actually really good in talking about his mistakes. It wasn't like a BS job interview answer of what's your biggest weakness? I just work too hard. And, it wasn't one of those. It was a real vulnerable, legit mistake story. And I said, I've got one. Hopefully I can find others. And, at this point, I'm up to over 225 episodes. Wow. Of people who are willing to, I think of it as leading by example and sharing a mistake and how they learned from it.
Yeah, that's excellent. And that really ties the way you talk about it. The mistake prevention kind of turning into learning from your mistakes really goes hand in hand with that culture piece, that it's got to be an environment where people feel okay to identify this didn't go well, but here's what I can do better next time. So I'm glad you put it that way.
Yeah.
225, that's an excellent number, because I'll tell anybody who listens that I make mistakes on a daily basis. So I get some I get strange looks, but it helps me, A, be okay to trying new things, and then B, all right, well, this is what I can do differently when I have a similar sort of circumstances. So I really like the way you walked us through that.
And I sorry to interrupt, but I want to emphasize, I make mistakes all the time too, right? So I'm not doing a podcast about mistakes because I think I don't make mistakes. I do.
And I think that it starts at, I have young children, and I think that they even look at me strange when I tell them, yeah, dad doesn't know, or dad makes mistakes. And it's making it okay to, I think the trying new things is the kind of where this starts, where it's with the prevention of kind of errors can go backfire. Because this is safe. I know how to do this, and you never leave that lane. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's totally true. So it's very situational. So I'm glad you brought that up, because there are some mistakes you work really hard to prevent, such as giving the wrong medication to a patient in a hospital setting, or putting the wrong part on a car, or putting that part on the wrong way where the quality or safety of the customer could be bad. When we're trying to innovate or even just trying to improve, we need to expect mistakes and almost invite them. Like to the idea, I can't think of how many guests have said, if you're not making any mistakes, you're not trying hard enough to innovate. But I think when we expect to make mistakes and we know we can't possibly always be right when we're doing new things or doing them a new way, I think there are strategies, including using small mistakes to prevent huge mistakes in those types of circumstances.
Yeah, and that's a good comparison. And then the podcast platform is great that there's the conversation, there's the communication around it. How have you been, either guest or in your work, how have you been able to get people to not only kind of say fess up, but to be willing to talk about things that didn't work well? It's like, well, that was a disaster. Let's talk about it.
Um, it's a good question. I mean, I've tried to frame it even from that initial invitation with Kevin Harrington and with others, and CEOs and founders and people from other professions who I've interviewed. I try to frame it as an environment where we're celebrating the learning and the growth that comes from it. I try to make clear this is not a place where I'm going to browbeat you and ask, what the heck were you thinking? So I think that might help. There's also that self-selecting population of people who know what they're signing up for. And I'll tell you, one of the podcasts mistakes I made a couple of times was coming into a recording with a guest who wasn't properly prepared to answer that question, because usually it was a miscommunication because there was like a third-party PR firm involved. Now, I don't mean to blame them. I learned to take responsibility for the need to not surprise anybody with that question. And that means like holding really firm. I'm like, we need to do a quick pre-call. Like, I just want to eyeball to eyeball through Zoom, confirm like you've thought about, or you're going to think about this question, because like throw that question to somebody on the spot at a dinner or a party, like it's going to be hard to answer and they might not want to answer. So you've got to make sure people are cool with it, and you've got to give them time to reflect and think of, okay, well, which story am I going to tell, and let them think about it. So I think that's been one of the keys.
Yeah, that's a good example. The kind of not having the preparation. And you mentioned earlier the interview question of, tell me about a time something went wrong. How have you been able to, or I should say, how do you help others know what mistakes to share in those settings, or when to kind of to draw the line? Because there have been interview settings, and I'm probably guilty of this myself, where it's like I say something along the lines of, here's what I did wrong, and you just see the look. It's like, well, that was probably not something I should have shared at this point. So how can you kind of draw those boundary lines?
Well, I mean, the person you're talking to might not be disapproving. They might just be surprised that you were open about sharing something that went wrong, a mistake, a failure, whatever word you might use. But like, I think, in a workplace setting, somebody's willingness to admit a mistake, I think there's two pieces. Like, one is internal. Like, what sort of history or experiences have we had, whether it was through childhood or through school or through jobs, where we've been shamed for mistakes or been taught that mistakes are something you don't admit? Like, some of that may be very sort of internally driven. We can try to work on that individually. Look, I'm not a psychologist or a therapist. I'm not saying you would need a therapist, but like, it's something to work through of like, can you admit mistakes to yourself? Maybe as a first step. And I've tried to do some things like just calling out mistakes in a non-shaming sort of way of like, I try like just to acknowledge, even if it's something small. Okay, my mistake, like, and like that's okay. Let's acknowledge it. Let's move on. If it's a mistake we're repeating, let's try to figure out maybe why we're making the mistake. Bad assumption, lack of knowledge, type of thing. And I think in a workplace, though, the second dynamic, if we can get past admitting the mistake to ourselves, is the relationship in your interaction with your manager or other leaders or even coworkers. And I've been fortunate to be able to do a little bit of formal studying in a field called psychological safety. Again, not a psychologist. I'm an engineer who's trying to learn about these things. But for psychological safety to take root in an organization, for people to feel safe, to decide it's safe to speak up about things, including, hey, I made a mistake, leaders really have to lead the way. Like, people are going to follow the lead of their boss. And I'm fortunate to work with leaders, for example, at that software company KaiNexus, the CEO and other senior leaders will admit mistakes. They will say they were wrong. They share that not for shaming or ridicule or anything, but just to acknowledge it. I think that builds trust with employees because, look, they know you're not perfect anyway, and I think acknowledging mistakes gives permission for others to do the same. And then when they do, you've got to react constructively and kind of focus on why did that happen, not who messed up. What could have allowed that to occur? What do we learn from that? What would we do differently? How might we try to prevent mistakes going forward? Or again, in the case of innovation, you try something, it didn't quite work the way you expected. Let's adjust. Right? You might not have to give up. So again, it's pretty situational. There are some mistakes I think we would look and say, okay, there's nothing to gain from this other than learning how to not do it again. Like, for example, like I've only done this once in 750 different podcast interviews. I forgot to hit record. I just plain forgot to hit record. So look, that's a mistake I'd like to think shouldn't have happened. I've managed to not let it happen again, and there are better technologies now. You can set a Zoom meeting to auto record when it starts. But yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to leaders doing what they can to let people know, or at least try to encourage them to believe that it's safe to speak up about mistakes.
And that's really an excellent way to describe the culture, because I think the setting makes a big difference as far as what people are willing to share, both to themselves and to others, and then what the kind of next step repercussions, if you will be that this is normal, or this is what we are expected to do, and here's how we're going to handle it, as opposed to I got to make sure nobody ever finds out about this, because if I do, there's going to be adverse reaction. So the way you describe the culture there, it makes sense that we're going to try new things, we're going to innovate, we're going to try to get better, and along the way, the things are going to go left. We're going to have to figure out what to do better next time. So that's excellent how you describe it.
And I think acknowledging that mistakes in a lot of situations are bound to happen is not giving people permission to be reckless. People don't want to make mistakes, so that's why, I mean, I think, again, if it's like an innovation setting, you really have to sort of say, hey, they're not all going to be winners, kind of new ideas, new marketing experiments or what have you. And then in certain situations, again, let's say in certain, healthcare settings or with aviation, there are certain mistakes that you try, through checklists or mistake proofing approaches. You try really, really hard to prevent the mistake. But then if there's even, a near miss, that's got to be embraced as a learning opportunity to prevent the next version of that event that could have been catastrophic.
Yeah, I'm going to try to transition here with that. You mentioned certain areas where there's be reactions, or there'll be results that'll be terrible, for lack of a better word, when you talk about healthcare, when we talk about aviation, and we talk about kind of the fixing the automobile example that you gave. You wrote the book Lean Hospitals. Those are two words most people know, what they are, but very rarely do we see them together. How are you able to see that in your career, and what do you hope people take from when they see, well, what would a lean hospital look like?
Yeah. So, when we talk about the word lean, I think in the subtitles of my book, I try to summarize the book in the subtitle, or at least some of the main things. So the subtitle of the book, Lean Hospitals, is improving quality, patient safety, and employee engagement. Like, those are, I think, like the three most important goals: safety, quality, employee engagement. Because if you do those three things, other benefits tend to follow. Efficiency, productivity, reducing waiting times, leading to lower cost, which is a different approach. And the word lean comes from what you might call lean management, or people in tech circles might know of, quote unquote, lean startup. Well, those ideas have their origins in something that was originally called lean production or lean manufacturing, which is a different way of labeling the Toyota production system so that it might be a little more palatable. Like, I started my career at General Motors, And in the mid 90s, it was clear GM was trying to catch up to Toyota, but they didn't want to admit that, right? So lean manufacturing, it's meant to be, it was the phrase was coined, it was meant to be a positive, meaning like you're accomplishing more with less, less waste, less resources, fewer problems. The word lean, though, I mean, it has some fairly negative connotations, I think, in a lot of settings. So that word was already out there. It's probably not the best word. Like if we were to call it effective manufacturing, or I don't know, something with a little bit more of a positive spin. But I mean, to me, it is a positive methodology, but sometimes that word, the word can get in the way. Yeah.
I mean, I'm a student of lean as well, so I understand everything you're saying. I think it does get a bad rap as kind of a cold way of looking at business. So that's why that's why to me, when I read it about hospitals, you mentioned quality, safety, and engagement with the people that are working there, all very important things, and all pieces of lean, because the fundamental principle, as you reference, is to take out waste or take out things that are not valuable to the end user or someone who is coming along the journey there. So
Yeah.
I think it makes sense. I think it's just a kind of a bad rap, or the way that people consider it. Well, you must be taking something out, or you must be cutting corners somewhere, and that's really not
That's
the way to look at
not,
it.
yeah. Right. But it rhymes with the word mean. So people hear, oh, lean and mean. And I would argue, look, the old financially driven cost cutting approach is mean and disrespectful and harmful in different ways. But yeah, I mean, it's about making work easier and less frustrating for people, helping them be more effective in what they're doing, and engaging them in the improvement process instead of just like hiring efficiency experts to come in and tell them what to do. Like it's really this opportunity to partner with people in improvement, whether that's a factory, a coffee shop, a hospital, or a software and technology company. Like the principles at a high level are the same.
Yeah, I mean, they're universal to almost all those settings, and as you referenced that, they deal with the kind of the front line, the employee who's working with that end user, the hospital, the patient. So they would know best what is actually happening on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I
Yes.
could certainly talk about this all day. I am a big fan, so thank
Yeah.
you for kind of tying those together.
Sure.
With the background in healthcare, how has that helped with the books, with the podcast? That's it's a very big but specific field. How are you able to kind of traverse that and get into other areas that are the material is applicable that you found there's an audience for?
That's a good question. I worked in manufacturing and a manufacturing focused software company in the first 10 years of my career. I thought that's what my career was going to be. It was just a matter of, okay, a smaller software company back to a bigger manufacturing company. I had this fairly narrow view of what I thought my career would be, and a certain exposure, a certain set of ideas. Coming into healthcare forced me to expand from the thinking part of my brain to more of the feeling part of my brain. And I'm not being dismissive of feelings, but that would be a very stereotypical engineer thing to do. Healthcare is much more in touch with the idea of caring, or in some circumstances, and like in a platonic way, the word love, right? So that's pushing it in other industries or whatever. But like this idea of caring for your employees, your colleagues, the patient connection. I mean, it's a caring profession. And here's the catch-22, or the conundrum is, people hear like, oh, ideas for manufacturing, like, oh, don't turn our hospital into a factory. Like, well, we're not trying to do that at all. We want it to be a better hospital, right? A hospital where people aren't feeling like they're treated like a number. Like we don't want nurses to be firefighting and coming up with their own workarounds to broken systems in a way that keeps them away from the patient, right? So we want to free up time for nurses and physicians to spend more time with patients. And the thing that's hard to traverse is when I'm trying to connect dots with people in healthcare, and I try to remember to meet people where they are. I might be the only person in the room who spent significant time in factories and in hospitals, and I can see parallels. And I think, I mean, I've made mistakes. I think, you have to be careful to not be off-putting in the language or the examples you use. Examples that might be comfortable to me might not be comfortable to somebody in healthcare. And I would say that's not their fault. They just don't have the same exposure to different experiences that I've had. So with a book like Lean Hospitals, I've tried to help that be like an inviting introduction to the topic, not completely shying away from examples in other industries, but I guess always have to guard against overdoing it. But so back to your question, though, I think there is a lot to learn from these different dimensions of healthcare that could be brought back into other industries. Some of the things you learn about the psychology of change management from, being in a healthcare setting, you run across, people with, counseling and social work and mental health backgrounds. And like those are things I would have never been exposed to as an engineer. And there are some concepts that I think would be helpful shared back in the other direction. Maybe that's a future book. What we can learn from healthcare, the good stuff. There's a lot of things you might not want to emulate, but there are some good things.
There we go. Thank you for walking us through that. That's helpful to hear. At the beginning of the conversation, kind of going backwards there, you mentioned mentors as far as being able to identify mistakes. At this point in your career, you've accomplished a lot of things. How are you, if you are, being a mentor to others, and where are you helping them go?
A lot of that opportunity, a lot of it comes through involvement with the software company KaiNexus that you mentioned when you introduced me, and I've brought up. I'm in a role as a senior advisor to the company. So, I got involved with the two co-founders. I'm not a co-founder, but I'm kind of like a third wheel, when the company was very much getting off the ground, and was able to have a role with the company. And now as it's grown over a decade to a team of 40 people and still growing. And, I give the co-founders a lot of credit that they've been willing to focus on culture as they go, and to be intentional about to be a culture of continuous improvement. We create software that's used by companies that are looking to manage their continuous improvement activity, right? So we want to emulate the culture that our customers are aspiring to, because it's good business for us. And then part of that has been, I think, in a lot of ways, an intuitive focus on. I think the leaders there intentionally do, or intuitively do, a lot of things that foster psychological safety. The way they react to mistakes, they're not people to get upset and yell and scream or do things like that. But then, a couple of years ago, I kind of brought into the conversation some observations of like, I see some patterns here of like, this is how people at KaiNexus tend to lead and react. Let's talk about it and put some language around it, so that as the company continues to grow, we can try to reinforce, some of that. So my role is indirect, but I think, there are a lot of employees in the company in their late 20s, and I try to model these different behaviors of being willing and able to admit a mistake instead of blaming others, and just trying to help reinforce when people do admit. I mean, this happens a lot, like in a weekly Friday team conference call, where somebody will say, hey, here's a mistake I made this week. And they share it so that others can maybe benefit and learn. Of like, hey, if you might make that same mistake, here's something I did that I think helps. Like the focus is on that learning and sharing. And when that's happening, I try to really thank and reinforce people for doing that. So that's, and then a lot of times when I'm working with clients in different organizations, there's inevitably some younger employees that, I try to help mentor in the way, like when I was in my 20s, right out of school, I had some great mentors, and now you may think those mentors were about the age that I am now. I'm turning 50. So here we But yeah, I mean, it's a pleasure to try to mentor people in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and the conference call anecdote is a good one, kind of pulling together the culture for conversations around mistakes that, similar to problems, it's again good things to learn from, but you got to take that next step to identify, here's what we can do next time, here's a solution, here's a thing I tried that may or may not have worked, as opposed to, hey, this isn't working, or this didn't work out. What, who knows next time? So being able to be
Yeah.
proactive or build off of it.
Building off of it is key. So I real quickly, I mean, I think there's like three general reactions to a mistake. One is like the punitive reaction where people think, well, I've got to punish the mistakes. Then people will know not to make them. I'm like that. I don't think that's an accurate view of how the world works. There's a second approach. I call it the nice approach, where leaders might say things like, well, it's okay, Mike. I know you didn't mean to do that. Like, don't worry about it. And it's just sort of a soothing, comforting reaction, but then that's the end of it. Well, then do you want to keep being nice about the same mistakes week in and week out? Like, I think there's a third category. I've learned to use the word kind, where kind is more action oriented. It's more helpful. Like let's go beyond the nice to think about the learning and the prevention. That's I think the best way to try to react.
That's a perfect way to tie it, and it kind of dovetails. I just listened to Gary Vee's latest book. It's about a year old or so, but it's called 12 and a half, and it goes through 12 kind of mindsets, or 12
Mm.
things to stay. And the half is kind candor, he calls it. And he said that was a
Mm.
big missing piece for him, is that it was either that nice piece or that
Yeah.
kind of just go the other way, kind of just it was difficult about it. But the big thing there is being candid, being honest, but being kind about it, having the empathy when you do it. And as you said, that being nice, not helpful, but being kind and being truthful, that is the recipe
Yes.
for moving forward.
And you can do it respectfully. And look, instead of looking the other way when somebody is making a mistake, it's kind. It might be uncomfortable for the person giving the feedback or the person receiving it, but I would argue it's far more kind to try to point out the mistake in a way that's focused around improvement instead of punishment or ridicule or what have you. So yeah, kind doesn't always feel comfortable, but I think it's the better way to go. It's sort of like what people say, sometimes leaders say, it comes across different ways of like, it's better to be respected than to be liked. And I think it's better to be kind than it is to be nice.
Well said. That's a good place to kind of tie up this conversation on mistakes.
Okay.
I think we've talked a lot about the books you've written, how we should handle mistakes, the culture around that. Is there something I didn't ask you tonight that I probably should have?
Oh, that's a good question. I've been asked that before and it makes me freeze every time. I don't know why that is. It's a mistake. Is it a mistake that I can't answer that, or am I just struggling? I don't have a good way. I don't have a good way to answer that. I'll tell you though, like just as a to me, it's a funny story. Like, I'm fortunate to be able to do different things, right? I have my own business where I do, writing and speaking and consulting. I'm involved in the software company, and it's not a traditional job. And I mean, sometimes people will ask, in the tone of voice, it's interesting. It's like, so wait, what do you do? What do you do? Or like they're in a way they're asking like, what do you make money off any of this? But so I'm fortunate to be able to do a mix of different things. It's not always easy. I will give credit to an incredibly supportive wife who has a very traditional, amazing corporate career path that gives me some latitude to go and do some things that are entrepreneurial and a little riskier. So I give her a lot of credit and thanks for giving me the space to do these different things.
Very nice. Very
It
nice.
wouldn't work for everybody.
No.
Meaning, the solopreneur hustle, struggle, whatever you call it,
So I will sometimes start here, but since you mentioned that, I'm gonna end. So if you do meet someone new, how do you describe what you do?
There's maybe an opportunity to try to reframe that. I mean, because I do have this kind of long-standing passion around helping people get better at learning from mistakes. So I don't know, like I don't, is there some sort of I don't want to sound like a glib label of like I'm the mistakes guy, but I don't know if that I don't know how that sounds on first class. I mean I will generally say I have my own business. I write. I should include publisher, right? So I'm author, publisher, speaker, consultant, mix. Maybe I should talk to. I'm clearly not a marketing and branding expert. Is there someone else you've interviewed that I should talk to?
We'll get the introduction out there. Mark, where can our listeners find you if they want to connect or learn more?
Yeah, the book website is mistakesbook.com. The My Favorite Mistake podcast can be found at mistakespodcast.com. And my website is my name, markgraban.com. I can be found on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active. That's the social media platform that I'm most active on. And thankfully my name's unique enough. Google Mark Graban. There's one other Mark Graban that I know of in the US, and maybe he's happy that he's hidden and in the Google search. But yeah, I'm pretty easy to find online.
He's not the mistakes guy. That's you.
I'm sure the other Mark Graban makes mistakes too. I haven't met him.
Well,
but
Mark,
hey, we all make mistakes. So I would assume the other Mark Graban does too.
there you go. There you go. Mark, this
This
is
Mark Graban
fantastic.
does.
Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to next time.
All right, Mike. Yeah, thanks for your questions. Thank you for having me.
Of course.